I will continue that fight here and beyond. But this is not my home.
When you get back to your home, who supports you?
The common people.
Let's be generous and assume that's going to happen. What was that like? Ruling without the rich? Not enough.
Lannister, Targaryen, Baratheon, Stark, Tyrell. They're all just spokes on a wheel. This one's on top, then that one's on top, and on it spins, crushing those on the ground.
It's a beautiful dream. Stopping the wheel. You're not the first person who's ever dreamt it.
I'm not going to stop the wheel. I'm going to break the wheel.
That was Daenerys Targaryen, the mother of dragons in Game of Thrones, wanting to break the wheel. In a recent article on the Aeon Eye, past guest Alex Rivera connected Daenerys to the Gnostic Noria and the divine feminine in Gnosticism. I go a bit further now. After all, in the Sethian myths, isn't Sophia the mother of the dragon-bodied demiurge and his many reptilian archons? Isn't her mission, after her fall from the pleroma, an abortion we call reality, to break the wheel of karma once and forever? Despite what New Agers might think, isn't Sophia's true nature fair but unbalanced? A thermonuclear spiritual being that will wipe out all caste in the cosmos, making God and slug equal?
She tore a hole in our universe, a gateway to another dimension. A dimension of pure chaos.
Isn't her only mission to release from the bondage of cosmic slavery our divine spark that feeds greedy angels, like Daenerys' mission of freeing slavery in Westeros from the greedy elite? Like the secret book of John says, and our sister Sophia is she who came down in innocence in order to rectify her deficiency. Therefore she was called Life, which is the mother of the living, by the foreknowledge of the sovereignty of heaven. And through her they have tasted perfect knowledge, perfect Gnosis.
You no trouble. Me, fifth element. Supreme being. Me, protect you.
The sacred and profane mission of this show is to reveal the many incarnations and prisms of the Gnostic Sophia. And that of course includes the original Scarlet Witch herself, Mary Magdalene, the woman who knew the all, or understood completely, as Jesus calls her in the dialogue of the Savior. In this episode, we reveal the sensual aspects of Mary Magdalene, and you will see there is indeed something about Mary.
Look, we're all in love with Mary.
But first, please allow me to introduce myself and this show. This is Aeon by Gnostic Radio, broadcast at the virtual Alexandria, that state of mind where East meets West, always through the God above God that can. We're doing the bidding of the mother of the god of this world, and the mother of dragons, rescuing divine sparks one pink beam at a time since 2006. I like this quote my friend Errol sent me from the show Happy-ish. It's from the Ellen Barkin's character. It goes, I take comfort in the belief, not in a good God, but a bad God. He's not a clockmaker, but a swatch maker. It's crappy, easy, cheap. The work of an unintelligent designer.
God isn't interested in technology. He knows nothing of the potential of the microchip or the Silicon Revolution. Look how he spends his time. 43 species of parrots. Nipples for men.
That's Sophia's child, And that is the child of our ego that causes so many collie wobbles in this world. Orthodox movements lack imagination, and only we Gnostic-minded can breathe color into this Pleasantville called existence. We're going to assist in breaking that wheel once and for all, my beloved truth seekers, by creating better than the creator gods, by unleashing our inner Prometheus, by shining like crazy diamonds, by writing our own gospel and living our own myth.
A world without rules and controls, without borders or boundaries. A world where anything is possible.
I am Abraxas, that terrible god above God as the ancients knew him. And Carl Jung knew him, and Basilides knew him, and the Knights Templar knew him, and Hermann Hesse knew him, and Thomas More knew him, as Utopia was originally called, yes, the island of Abraxas. And you know Abraxas, for you are him as well. I come to you in my meat machine incarnation of Miguel Connor, broadcasting from the lawful but frigid dystopia of Chicago. I am your Pompadour of Gnosis, that ship smoke on the horizon, that mad laughter from the black scarecrow hung on the tree of life, as Nietzsche described. And so are you.
You clearly don't know who you're talking to, so let me clue you in. I am not in danger, Skylar. I am the danger.
We have the oceanic pleasure on this mid-July, the year of our demiurge 2015, of being joined by Joanna Kujawa, author of several books, including the Jerusalem Diary, Searching for the Tomb and the House of Jesus. Joanna is an academic in her own right, and certainly a rising scholar in Gnostic studies and Mary Magdalene wisdom. For more information on Joanna, please visit her website, joannakujawa.com. That's JoannaKujawa.com. Whether it's Mary or Sophia, Joanna knows that the divine feminine in Gnosticism is the ultimate reboot of true consciousness. After all, as the Gospel of Mary says, where the mind is, there is treasure. Do not lay down any rules beyond what I appointed you, and do not give a law like the lawgiver, lest you be constrained by it. And in the dialogue of the Savior, Mary further states, there is but one saying I will speak to the Lord concerning the mystery of truth. That is, in this have we taken our stand, and to the cosmic are we transparent.
What you do makes a difference. It makes a difference, first of all, in material terms, makes a difference to other people, and it sets an example. And in short, I think the message here is that we should never simply write ourselves off and see ourselves as the victim of various forces. It's always our decision who we are.
A tantric Mary Magdalene, you may ask? Sensual? I've made the case here that Sophia is a sensual goddess, a trickster deity, and as much as an anti-hero as any, well, character in Game of Thrones. And so is Mary Magdalene. Joanna will make an even more excellent case.
She is the herald of the apocalypse, the harbinger of death. They must not follow her.
Please support Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio in any way you can. A few shekels here and there. Join my Patreon campaign, where you pay only when I produce. Buy some of my reality-dispanding, mind-expanding books, like Voices of Gnosticism, Stargazer, or Heretic. Subscribe to our archive of past shows. Your continued support keeps this Red Pill cafeteria open. Much appreciation to you homoplasmates who support me on a weekly basis. I should mention that I am an Amazon.com affiliate, So any books you order from the God grant me a kickback. In fact, if you order anything, whether it's clothes, appliances, or sex toys, click through the site first, and I will get a kickback from that as well, even if you don't order anything advertised on the site. It costs you nothing. We're going to build vast futures of light here at the virtual Alexandria as we continue on this dark odyssey through the gnashing rocks of Orthodoxy. We're going to do so many wonders together. I just know it. I just know it. And I will be with you every step of the way.
First, you have to give up. First, you have to know, not fear, know that someday you're gonna die.
Everything you've been told is a lie, and that's the best news you could have possibly had. Bill Cosby is a rapist, and Jared is a child pornographer. Nothing is real. Everything is permitted, said Hassan Sabah, the founder of the Assassins. And J. Krishnamurti said, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." Your Buddha's on the road, and heroes need to be killed. God keeps making universe after universe until he can get the right one. But his archons mismanage with their programmer marketing content. Hypatia hasn't made it home yet. We started zero at Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, a blank canvas, and we paint creation with the stars of our fiery imagination. The wheel is breaking.
The Matrix is a system, Neo. That system is our enemy. These people are still a part of that system, and that makes them our enemy. You have to understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. And many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system, that they will fight to protect it.
After the interview, we will present some ethereal music by Matthew James Ramo from his album Psychotronic Warfare. The tune is Cult of Black Gnosis, and it truly exemplifies the ethos of Aeon Byte. Check it out. We end with what Sophia tells her son, Yaldabaoth, in the secret book of John. It goes, "An immortal man has existed before you, and will appear among your modeled forms. He will trample you to scorn as a potter's clay is pounded. At the consummation of your works, all the effects that truth has made visible will be abolished, as though they had never been." That is you. That is us. That is Sophia ready to break the wheel.
Why do you wear that armband?
Because I'm in mourning.
For whom?
For God. If God exists, then he's a think, or more likely a foot. A giant, all-knowing, all-powerful foot. I don't belong to the God is alive and hiding in Argentina club. But I believe in the devil, all right. You know why? Because the prick keeps doing commercials.
Original sin might be real.
Hello, operator.
Maybe it was something genetic.
Can you prove there's a foot?
There are some arguments from reason.
Are those the things we use to justify dropping atomic bombs on Japan?
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by Joanna Kujawa to discuss a lot of heresy. She is the author of Jerusalem Diary, Searching for the Tomb and House of Jesus. How are you doing today, Joanna?
Very good, thank you. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte. So why don't we start with more or less the beginning. How did you come to know those perennial heretics, the Gnostics?
It took me a while, actually. I wasn't interested in Gnostics for a long time. First, just as a background, I studied medieval philosophy and Christian philosophy at the University of Toronto and the Pontifical Institute. They have this wonderful Center for Medieval Studies there. And, and I was doing all the nice non-heretical stuff. I was fascinated with early Christianity, though. And I came across a fantastic book by Peter Brown, Augustine of Hippo. And there, I started to learn about Augustine and his Manichaean past. And, how there were these other heretics like Donatists and Pelagians. And I got fascinated with Julian of Eclanum, who apparently said that there was nothing like an original sin. So I thought it was interesting, but I never got really into this, because I was just very busy being a good student. So nothing came out of this. But I was very interested in early Christianity, and I was very interested also in this kind of sort of heretical thinkers, like, for example, John Scotus Eriugena, which is a 9th century heretic, and his kind of Eastern influences and Neoplatonic influences on him and so on. So I was just kind of heading in this direction, but I didn't know anything about it. So it didn't happen until many years later, when I finished my PhD here in Melbourne at Monash University, and I went through some kind of personal crisis and met 2 Australian men who said that they are going back to Jerusalem because they believe that they found the house and tomb of Jesus there. I mean, house in Nazareth and tomb in Jerusalem. And I don't know what happened to me. Suddenly, my soul went on fire, and I was just obsessed with this idea of going to Jerusalem. And I said, well, what do you mean the tomb of Jesus isn't like, the Holy Sepulchre? I was still a very good girl, and believed everything. and they said, no, actually, it's not necessarily so. And we started to talk about Gnostic Gospels. So it came completely out of my education, which is so funny because, all of us, degrees, in Christian philosophy, and I never really got into this, and they said, why don't you read the Gospel of Mary Magdalene? And I said, I heard about Gospel of Thomas, but the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and I thought, this is amazing. And I started to read the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, translated by Jean-Yves Leloup, whom I have grown since then to completely admire. I am a big fan, of this. And again, here I found this idea, in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, when she says, there is no sin. And this idea kind of was very important for me and revolutionary for me, as many years ago as well. And I started to do research, on Mary Magdalene, and then all of these things became clear for me. I find out, the whole idea that she was not a prostitute, that she most likely was the favorite disciple of Jesus, that she was such an important figure for, early Christianity. And I started to devour also Elaine Pagels, who, like me, was interested in early Christianity, except, that she, of course, became the Sophia of a new Gnostic movement for me. So that was the beginning of his journey. And later on, I started to look at other Gospels, including the Gospel of Philip. And there was also this, very interesting concept. Philosophical concepts, and if you want, we can go into this, but also the idea, that sexuality could be a spiritual thing. And I was already interested in this kind of topic because I already started, as I was moving away from the Orthodox Christianity, I started to be interested in some forms of Hinduism, especially Kashmir Shaivism, which is basically a philosophy of Tantra. And there, of course, there's a lot of written about sexuality as being means to attaining a spirituality. So I started to make these connections between Tantra, Gospel of Philip, and Gospel of Mary Magdalene. So this became my passion, and eventually I wrote another book, The House of the Beloved, which, I hope to publish soon. I'm going to publish us with it next week, so we'll see.
So for the listener, this might be a bit shocking because, after all, the Gnostics, even though the church fathers talked about, and also some philosophers who actually had no reason to lie, which Celsus and Plotinus talked about the Gnostics were into some sort of sex magic. But when you read their Gospels, they don't seem to be that much interested in sex except to use it in their mythology. So this might be shocking to others. So where exactly, or tell us a little about where you find this Tantric philosophy in the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip?
I'm not saying that it's a tantric philosophy. Just because I was interested in tantric philosophy, I found elements of, seeing sexuality as spiritual in the Gospel of Philip. So this is what I'm saying, but by no means, like tantric practices, but basically saying things like that, the kiss is basically the holy breath, and that woman and a man, the sexual union between a woman and a man is holy. There's nothing metaphorical there. It talks about sexuality. So it's not metaphorical. Gospel of Philip basically in many ways is different than other Gnostic writings about sexuality, and says some radical things such as, for example, good is not always good, bad is not always bad, light is not always light, and darkness is not always dark, which is also very similar to what, for example, Kashmir Shaivism on Tantra says that everything is sacred, but the distinction between pure and impure is basically a distinction of the mind, but it doesn't exist in existence, so to speak.
Yes, that certainly makes sense. I mean, the Gospel of Philip does have some very powerful ideas, well, like all Gnostic texts, on how the illusion of things and the union of yourself in the world.
Correct. And also, when going back to sexuality, it basically says that it has to be the union of two persons and not two appetites. So it means it's not just lust, but if there's a true emotion and true intention for the union, this is a sacred union. And it doesn't even really mention marriage that much, it just says sexual union is holy. So I thought in this respect it was a little bit different, than other writings. And basically there's this kind of one passing line that says, if a woman loves her lover, her child would look like her lover. If a woman loves her husband, her child would look like her husband. Supposedly stressing, that is the intention and the emotion that is more important than the act itself.
And in the Gospel of Mary, what do you see? What are some of these other things you see, these metaphors that you found, Joanna?
Oh, no. I just don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying that they're actually tantric metaphors. I'm just saying how we can use, certain ideas from Gospel of Mary Magdalene or of Gospel of Philip that work for us nowadays. And for example, for me, the most important thing in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene was when one of the disciples, I don't remember at the stage, asks Mary, please tell us about the sin. She says, there is no sin. She says, the sin, there's nothing, no such thing as an original sin. What we do, however, it is that we make choices that are based on our lower instinct instead of on our higher capacities. And as such, we create suffering for ourselves and others.
Yes, it talks about it. Yeah, only the laws is what creates sins. I think that's what it says in the Gospel of Mary. It's a very powerful line.
It's and so it's a very powerful line. So this was the most striking line for me, in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and with respect to sexuality.
To you, who do you see Mary Magdalene as? What does she represent to you in a spiritual context as you've gone on this journey, as you talk about in your book, and the spiritual journey of yourself? Who is Mary Magdalene to you?
That's a very interesting question because, I like to think about Mary Magdalene more as an archetype. For us, what does she mean really for us? Because, she was, through the ages, she was seen as the favored disciple. She was seen as the redeemed sinner. She was seen as the adulteress, and so on. So, even wrongly so, as a prostitute. And I thought that what really interests me in this archetype of Mary Magdalene is that somehow this idea of sexuality and spirituality is meeting in her. They are meeting in her. You see, because she's seen either, the favorite disciple of Jesus, or she's seen either, or she's seen as an adulteress or a prostitute. And I thought that it was interesting that, this idea of sexuality and spirituality plays itself on our minds. And, and Mary Magdalene is the center of this playground. For me, this is exactly who she is. That means, for example, I was thinking, why, for example, if it's true, as Jean-Yves Leloup says, that, the Vatican admitted in 1969 that there is no scriptural mistake, there is no scriptural evidence that Mary Magdalene, was the woman sinner or the prostitute. Why this idea of this woman sinner, Mary Magdalene as woman sinner, place ourselves on our imagination. And I think that, it's in some ways seductive, to see this kind of a sexual figure in Jesus's life, right? And obviously Hollywood plays on this and so on. And although I really appreciate and I really, really enjoy myself, kind of historical exploration and philosophical explorations into Gnosticism, I think that we would give it injustice if we just treat it as some kind of historical play, and possibly we will never know who real Mary Magdalene was. And I think that perhaps there is no contradiction in that she was, like Gospel of Philip says, for example, one of the most controversial lines there, that he kissed her on her lips, right? And she was his koinonos, which means his partner, basically, and made the other disciples jealous, that perhaps she was his partner and perhaps she was also his favorite disciple and perhaps she was also a sexual being. I think that this is when actually the beauty of it comes out. Why do we have to make this kind of distinctions, Mary Magdalene and this kind of androgynous spiritually person, which is mentioned also, for example, in Pistis Sophia and so on, or, as some Gnostics, refer to her like in this way, because, perhaps it was somehow threatening to them, first of all, that she was a woman, and maybe second of all, that she was a sexual woman. So I think that nowadays, we could read this a little bit differently. I don't like this kind of orthodox reading, either of the canonical Gospels or, of Gnostic Gospels. I'm more interested in what we can do with this nowadays that helps us. There's lots of discussion nowadays, for example, about gay marriage, about sexuality, not necessarily in a gay context, but in any context, and women's sexuality. And I think that this is where the figure of Mary Magdalene kind of resurfaces in a very interesting way. Of someone who was both infused with spirit, as I think Jesus says in Pistis Sophia, and who is both infused with spirit and sexual.
Yes, very well said. And she definitely was a threat, Joanna. I mean, after all, and I think Steph and Heller would agree, her biggest threat, I think, was being a woman, a multi-dimensional woman. That was a threat, but her having Gnosis, that was probably the biggest threat. I think in the dialogue of the Savior, it says she was the woman who knew the all. She understood completely. And that was dangerous. Knowledge is dangerous.
Knowledge is dangerous, and imagine like a woman having knowledge.
Yeah, bad.
And what I like about Leloup, he's a Frenchman, so he looks at it in a different way, right? So he says, and why imagine her as this, androgynous being, that has the Gnosis? Why not imagine her in her lovely sexuality, he says, this lovely woman who has Gnosis. And it's a little bit like it's a challenge for us, like Woody Allen said something that about I think intelligent woman being beautiful, where it's such a contradiction, but it's not a contradiction. And I think that Mary Magdalene can symbolize this for us. And if you said what she means for me, I think this is what exactly she represents for a modern woman, that you don't have to be as a woman like in the past. You have to be either a nun, or a mother, and basically you can be both. You can be sensual, you can be enlightened, you can be intelligent, and this is what she represents for us. And this is how I see really her for myself, and for modern women as this new archetype. And it's quite interesting, she resurfaces for us. When I give my talks, people are immensely interested, in who Mary Magdalene was, and maybe for us, who could she be for us also? You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. She's a multidimensional woman. Even in, I don't see a problem with the church. Well, to an extent, I don't see a problem with the church calling her whore. I mean, in I forget which Nag Hammadi library text it is. It says Sophia is a whore, and a whore was simply a symbolical meaning of a fallen soul that was trying to get back. We are all whores because we're all lost souls.
Because we are in a Gnostic, in a Gnostic sense, really.
We're abused by the material world. We fall seduction to the money of the world, and we sell ourselves, all of us.
Yes, we are the dead, basically, because we just sold out to the material way of being. And also, I think that, as a woman, and just for modern women as well, lots of was written about divine feminine and actually how, it is always male priests that say, no, we have divine feminine because we have Virgin Mary. But frankly, Virgin Mary is not a very attractive model for a modern woman. We all want this kind of holy motherly figure in our lives, but do we want to be that? As a modern woman, would you like to be like that? And I remember when I was a little girl, I was praying to Virgin Mary, bringing her flowers, there are lots of, little altars, where I'm coming from, and so on. But when I grew up, I started to resent it. I thought, I don't want to be that. I don't want to be the submissive, passive suffering, I want to discover the world, and I think this is what's going on nowadays for women. I want to be, I want to be fully who I am, and just, I'm sorry, I would say, to all the males that say, Virgin Mary is, the divine feminine. This just won't do. And I think that, this is when Mary Magdalene becomes such an important symbol, or can become for us as an important symbol, as somebody who embodies all of this, that a woman can, everything that a woman can be.
Oh, I agree. And in fact, I always like to quote from Yano Kuliano's Tree of Gnosis. He talks about how Sophia is a sensual being. And that always shocks people because Sophia is this sort of cold archetype or personhood or idea of God that fell from the pleroma. But what I mean by, or what he means by sensual, is not somebody who just wants sex. It's somebody who wants to experience everything with the senses, who wants to explore. She's a curious being. She's disobedient. She creates, and she's experiencing all these passions in the world as a multidimensional woman should.
Yes, that's right. So this is what she started to represent for me. Mind you, my view of all of this was very much influenced, as I said, by my studies of Kashmir Shaivism, which is the study basically of the Tantra. Because as I was started to move away, from this dogmatic form of Christianity in which I grew up and began to be interested in Hinduism, I discovered that Kashmir Shaivism or, Tantra was actually kind of a counterpart to proper, so to speak, of Hinduism. And that actually Tantra was started by a woman philosopher called Arda Triambaka. And it happened probably sometimes in 8th or 9th century in India. And then in 10th century, a famous Indian philosopher called Abhinavagupta actually wrote a famous book, The Light on the Tantras, in which he describes exactly that everything is sacred, that all the distinctions, almost like the distinctions that are present in Abraxas, are just basically the polarities, basically the way we view the world. But dualism is actually, the way we view the world, but everything in the world itself is completely sacred. And it includes, the distinction between pure and impure. And in the 29th chapter of his Tantra Loka basically describes the Kulak ritual, which is the, scandalous kind of tantric sexual ritual in which, which claims, that through sexual practices you can reach enlightenment.
And this is through the release of the Kundalini, right?
Through the release of Kundalini, but again, like in Gospel of Philip, it basically says that it's not what you do, this is how you do it. What is your intention? So before the sexual ritual, for example, you focus, on your attainment. You focus on the union with the divine. And the whole thing is, they were very naughty, you see, because they thought that we are going to use what you consider impure to get to the purest things of all, to the divine. to achieve an enlightened state of consciousness or expand the state of consciousness. So, for example, sexuality was seen as something only for procreation, and they said, no, we are going to use it. In fact, it was almost a prerogative that you, in Kula ritual, that you should be engaged in a sexual act, but it was, highly ritualistic, and you had to say mantras and so on, with a stranger, because no attachment was possible, no romantic attachment, and your focus was on spiritual attainment.
Yeah, that's very interesting because after all, the Carpocratians, they were accused of doing, again, all this sex magic. And later I can give you some evidence that it might actually be true, but their philosophy is you have to experience everything in the world and make your karma clean so you can get out of this world. And then some Kabbalists, like the Frankian Kabbalists, believe you have to experience every sin. Don't actually go out and kill somebody, but at least envision something bad that you don't want to actually do, because then, of course, you're breaking somebody else's rights. But through this sort of embracing the sin, that's how you get through the other side.
That's right, you get to the other side, and actually the other side is the same side, because once you experience it, you see that everything is divine.
And I guess I should mention the evidence for this, and I've been told this by various scholars, including John Turner, who was one of the translators of the Nag Hammadi, is that you have these two philosophers, Celsus and Plotinus, and they talk about everything about the Christians, and they're not lying. They have no reason to lie because they're very intelligent, and they think the Christians are like just another upstart religion. And they're listing everything about the Christians, and they're right. But once they get to the Gnostics, they list everything about them right, but they always include sex magic. They had no reason to lie, so that's a very interesting thing. So in a way, you could be right, or a lot of people could be right about the ancient Gnostics and what they were doing. Well, specifically in Alexandria.
Especially, yeah, I love Alexandria. It was probably the most magical place on earth, in the 1st, 2nd century, especially. So who knows what we're doing there? But I agree, and I really appreciate your fantastic, deep knowledge, of Gnosticism, and from a historical and philosophical point of view. What I'm trying to do here is, kind of thinking how we can use it, for nowadays, for discussions that are going on nowadays, and maybe make some kind of connections with other religions and other movements, because everybody nowadays is talking about, for example, the interfaith, but nobody wants to make this kind of connections if they are kind of sound a little bit dangerous, for example, pertaining to sexuality, for example. Let's see, what this, because it seems to me that in almost every religious tradition, including, Christianity, and for example, in the Gospel of Philip, or some mentions in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, or for example, in Hinduism, in Tantric tradition, or in some aspects, of Kabbalah, or, even in Sufism, there are these elements of kind of using sexuality or sexual feeling for your attainment, for your spiritual attainment.
Yes, indeed, agreed. And any knowledge I have is because of wonderful guests like you and others who teach me. But by myself, I know very little, Joanna. So that's why we have this show, to spread the great wisdom of people that come on. And for the more mature audiences, and I do hope the audience is mature, let's talk about the sexual rituals. Because, for example, we had a guest here, and he talked about how in Sufism there's a ritual where Rumi and his, well, you might want to call him partner, Sham, would look at each other in the eyes intensely and sort of go to this tantric thing. This obviously he created. Do you have any modern sexual rituals that you could apply, that you could reveal to the listener, or is this something we're still in the works? I mean, whatever you're comfortable with, I don't know. I'm an old married guy, I don't know.
I don't know if I have modern, but I can tell you about the Kula ritual, which is, chapter 29 of Tantra Loka. And if somebody wants to check, it is Abhinavagupta is like the biggest Hindu philosopher. He wrote works on aesthetics and so on. And, he's being taught at universities as well, especially in aesthetics, but nobody mentions, Kula ritual because it's spooky. And it was, only recently translated to English, and it's scandalous, because the whole idea of Tantra, and this is what Abhinavagupta says, who was, a Brahmin, but in Hindu terms, Tantric, which is almost like a heretical ritual, right? In this respect, a secret ritual, which is also like a little bit like Gnosis, right? Because it was secret knowledge, and it had to be absolutely secret because it would be misunderstood and misused. And we can easily see how, sexuality could be misused, by people who are not ready. So he stresses,
Hindu culture is just as conservative as Christian culture.
Absolutely, and especially in sexual terms. So, it was only about the Brahmins, and it was only about procreations and no meat, no wine. And here, mind you, the guru has to choose, the teacher has to choose, people who are ready for this, and it's not one-on-one either, it's a group of people, but you are only with one partner. And, they start basically by, they prepare themselves by saying mantras, and putting themselves in a kind of meditative state of mind. But they also do all kinds of naughty stuff, like, for example, drinking wine, which we're not supposed to do, right? Drinking wine mixed with menstrual blood, because it's, again, kind of like we are saying here that we understand that what's pure and impure is just a mental distinction, that creation is sacred. Once, and then basically, it is like a room filled with fragrant flowers, and they start to massage themselves with oils, and perform, or sexual act, including, oral sex, especially, oral sex on women, because it's supposed to be, the worship of the divine, of the feminine divine, as they say. And they believed, and this is again the secret gnosis of Tantra, the secret teaching that he didn't want anybody to know except his closest circle. It is because they believe that, the universe was created by the meeting of the feminine and masculine aspects of the divine, of the creation, and that the sexual act recreates, when a man and a woman join, recreates the meeting of, so to speak, Shiva and Shakti, of the feminine and masculine element before the moment of creation. And when the lovers say, at the end, it is like Om. Right? Because it is like the moment that the universe became conscious. And they said that the universe is always pulsating with creation, and it is this how, human sexual organs pulsate during sexual act, So it is completely naughty.
I guess if I created the universe, I would have a cigarette. I would be God with a cigarette.
Have a cigarette, and we see like, which is also considered right? And this is this is the ritual, but it's absolutely done, in a proper state of mind, with partners that are chosen very carefully. And at the end, the man says a prayer to a woman: "I worship you, O goddess, in the temple of the body, night and day. When the bliss is aroused, the universe appears." So the universe is born out of bliss, right? That is the rapture, O goddess. Knowing that, let me reach the highest state. And apparently after that, men and women walk like gods and goddesses on earth. Probably like, walking on air a little bit, but in a more conscious state, because as this happens, you can actually feel the movement of the energy through your body. So it's a conscious process.
Yes, and it's very similar to the Gnostic Mass of Crowley, because they have the eating of the period cakes or the semen cakes, and then you have the priest goes down on the priestess and all that.
That's right. It's extremely similar, So I'm just looking about this. I'm looking at the similarities, and not necessarily, to just for historical reasons, but just simply for the discussions that we are, having right now about human sexuality, because what always bothered me, and that's why I kind of like this kind of contradiction about Mary Magdalene, is that, we have this distinction about sexuality and spirituality. And once when I was studying at the University of Toronto, I met this fantastic nun, and she said, why is it, that we draw this line, this is sexuality, this is spirituality, and she was a nun, okay? And I was just amazed by this, and I didn't do anything about it. And later, as I started to be interested in Tantra and also in Mary Magdalene, I started to draw these lines, and especially in Sufism as well, how sensuous Rumi is. What was really his relationship with Sham? We don't know it. I know that I think he eventually, Sham was killed because, their relationship was considered indecent, I think, so we don't know what was going on there. And why we always have to make this kind of distinction. So I'm just kind of intellectually interested in it, if everything is sacred, if creation is sacred, why we, have such a, create such a deep distinction between sexuality and spirituality, because as I wrote in one of my articles, they are the two most natural impulses in human life that I can think of. One is spirituality and one is sexuality. And I think that, if I believe in anything, I believe in spiritual evolution. And I believe that, for this evolution, this kind of synthesis has to happen. And this synthesis is also between sexuality and spirituality. We cannot, but the media doesn't help because it always portrays sexuality in an awful way.
Yeah, it makes it very materialistic. But Joanna, this is also a danger, because it doesn't matter whether you're Sufi or the Gnostics or the Neoplatonists or the Stoics, or even early Christians, there's always a danger you might be ruled by your emotions. And once your emotions take over, you're right back where you started, in the material muck. How do you not let your emotions be ruled? Because, for example, you talk about a partner that you don't know, but it's very easy for your emotions to come in, and suddenly there's an attachment, there's a misunderstanding. Yes. How do we not let our emotions rule our lives when we want to go above them?
Not only emotions, but just a simple desire. So it could be either just a romantic desire or sexual desire. And that's the danger. That's why they say also, Abhinavagupta is very clear about it. That's a dangerous path. And only that's why he kept it secret, and only for very advanced disciples. He shared it only with the very advanced disciples who he believed could handle this. That's why, in a sense, it's really not for everybody, because we have to ask ourselves, are we really ready for this? You meet a beautiful stranger, and what happens? Something great happens. You had a enlightening experience, and you just let it go of it. So this is the problem with it, right? So this is actually the problem with it, and he said it himself. It is a dangerous path, and he was introduced to this path because he was very much a philosophical explorer. He was introduced by one of his teachers called Shambunatha. And apparently the Kula ritual was introduced by a woman philosopher, Havtriyambaka, as I already mentioned this, so it's quite interesting, as a worship of the goddess. And Shambunatha introduced him to this worship, and I think that Abhinavagupta actually participated in this worship, in this Kula ritual, with Shambunatha's wife Bhagavati. So it was probably done in some kind of controlled environment. And, people try to imitate it, in some circles, but it is very difficult because, exactly for the same reasons. We can fall into matter, so to speak, right away, into physicality of this. But what interests me here is that there is this possibility, of this kind of experience when it happens. He also says that it can happen spontaneously sometimes, when you actually feel, the movement after reading, for example, of Tantra or the scriptures, and when you're involved in a unattached, so to speak, sexual encounter, you can feel the movement of the energy, or the Kundalini energy, as they say, and then you feel this kind of conscious, you actually feel it moving through your body, and it kind of turns consciously in a different direction that just actually brings you spiritual bliss and spiritual insight rather than, just physical pleasure. But how do we control this? I think we don't know.
Yeah, there's always a risk any kind of pursuit,
absolutely,
spiritual pursuit you take.
Yeah, and there are also this kind of ideas of perversion. For example, we have to make sure that this doesn't get into hands for Marquis de Sade, for example, right? Because it's in no way spiritual. But for example, French philosopher Charles Baudelaire, in The Flowers of Evil, beautiful book of poetry, on love. He says similar things. He must have had intuitively this kind of experience because he was in love with a prostitute. He called her his Black Venus. And I think she was from Martinique. And he says that he can see only after debauchery, he can see the spiritual skies. So he's talking about spiritual experiences after sexual encounters with his, paramour. So, so people experience this kind of things, but they are very very difficult to repeat, very difficult to predict, and probably completely impossible to control. That's why it was such a secret work, and it was only recently translated into English, and there are some scholars who seriously consider it and so on. But as to how to practice it, you probably enter a bit of a dangerous path. Not dangerous, in any metaphysical way, but can you really do this, without attachment?
And Joanna, when somebody asks you, when you do your lectures and your talks, or you're talking to people, what is Gnosis? What is this thing that Mary Magdalene experienced when she saw the all, or she understood the all? Well, how do you explain to people what Gnosis is to the best of your ability?
I think that secret knowledge, historically we're looking at secret knowledge almost like this kind of hidden knowledge, that maybe we can find some secret papyrus, or codex, that secret knowledge is there. But I do not think that it's actually this kind of knowledge. I think it's experiential knowledge, of the divine, like this intuitive understanding of complete oneness with creation, of complete oneness with the divine, fulfilling our divine potential as human beings. This is what I think Gnosis is, this kind of intuitive experience of the divine in our lives. And I think that any way that we can get there is valid, as long obviously no harm is being given to anyone, right? But and that's why, for example, and I think this is what Mary Magdalene experienced. And also in Tantric tradition is, they said, the reason why they're using sexuality is not only because they want to be naughty, and just let's try something, can we get enlightenment, by having sex or something. It was because they believe that it's such a powerful impulse, that it can take us faster. It is like an engine, and it can give us this wonderful experience of spiritual expansion when we feel one with creation.
And how do you see the problem of evil and suffering, Joanna? Do you take a more Eastern view that it's just an illusion, or what insights have you received in your life?
Suffering and evil, problem of evil was preoccupying me even when I was, a student at the University of Toronto. In fact, I wrote, about concept of evil in St. Augustine and so on. But obviously, they kind of get away with this basically, as a lack of goodness and so on in Orthodox Christianity. So it is a very difficult concept, especially the concepts of suffering. But the concept of evil, I think I'm tending towards, this, I don't know if it's a Hindu, proper Hindu tradition, but the Tantric tradition that evil is a little bit, it's a part of creation, is it possible that it is just a mental distinction? What do you think? That we see something only as evil, and this is a necessary part of creation. It's just part of it. It's a little bit, when you read about, Jung and his 7 sermons, when he talks about pleroma and he talks about abraxas, once something comes into creation, it comes into polarities. There is no God without evil. This is what he says in his first sermon, right? That's why the dead start to riot in his first sermon, because he says, so I think that it is simply a part of creation, and I'm not sure if we are ever able to, fully understand it. And suffering, obviously, it bothers me. But I dealt with this question a little bit in my book, especially when I was writing about, Jesus' suffering. But I think if we think about ourselves, suffering is only a part of our form, which is our humanity, so to speak. So it's a little bit like, if you're a human, you're going to suffer. You're going to probably encounter disease. You're probably and you're definitely going to encounter death. And it's part of our framing as humans. But I think on divine level, we are beyond good and evil, and we are beyond suffering. So it's just, our human form, our physical form that kind of engenders suffering, because suffering is basically a physical thing.
As the Zen Buddhists say, suffering there is, but none who suffer. It's an identity that we latch onto the world that brings us suffering.
Yeah, I think it's basically, I would say that suffering is it's only a physical thing. Meaning, as long as we're embodied and as long as we are limited by our minds and by our minds and by our bodies, there's going to be a suffering, which is mental and physical, but a material suffering, basically. But on a divine plane, I think that, there is no suffering. It's just part of human condition, being in a body engenders suffering. Because we are going to age, we are going to probably get sick, and we are going to die.
And you, of course, have studied Augustine, and I myself, I love him very much for much of his writings. I think he got a lot wrong. But what is your view on Augustine, even as you've evolved?
I really loved him when I was young, and I didn't even, hear much about, Gnostics and so on. Because he's such a passionate figure, in early Christianity, and he struggled, with his passions, also with his sexual passions. He was forced to abandon his lover of 18 years, right. Before he became a priest, and. So I think he's just a dramatic figure of early Christianity that for some reason really fascinated me, So, but he did get many things wrong. And for example, when he was talking about original sin, many scholars say that he basically misunderstood, some Greek translations, and his Greek was all, horrid, and he admitted to himself, that his Greek was very bad and so on. So I think that early Christian fathers were very interesting figures, but again, my focus here was, on how they unnecessarily, divided spirituality from sexuality. Jerome, for example, another fantastic figure of early Christianity.
Oh, he was a mess when it came to sex.
Yeah, he was crazy, like women around him had to smother themselves with mud, so he wouldn't get aroused, anything, something wrong here. And for example, he says he was on a desert, and eating one fig per day, and fasting, and he still saw dancing girls from Rome, bare-breasted dancing girls from Rome. So I think that although I didn't ponder on this that much, I was thinking, why all of this, early Christian fathers, this men, let's put it this way, who created, dogmatic Christianity, they were just so conflicted about their own sexuality, and yet, portrayed it also in such an unpleasant way for us, that people feel very sinful about it.
Well, because by then they didn't have the Gospel of Mary, so they were in trouble. They needed more Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, and they didn't have Gospel of Philip, either. So, we can joke about it. Or, there are some other early Christian saints, who actually had serious discussions, early monastic communities, how many involuntary nightly erections a man can have and still call himself a saint. And I think they reached a number of 3, but I don't remember if it was 3 per month or 3 per year. I think it was 3 per year. So these were serious discussions in early church. And if you're a bit of a rebel, and you're a woman, and you read it, you think, this man, they struggled themselves, and then they make it so prohibitive. And I can understand in some respect why, because we had some, in history, crazy figures, we don't want sexuality to be abused. But, if we just kind of switch our thinking about sexuality, not as something dirty, but as something perhaps sublime, perhaps it could be also one of the tools, for our fulfillment, for enriching our spirituality. So I'm kind of not yet completely clear on this, but I'm going in this direction, that we should actually, change our thinking about it, because the origin, of this kind of sinfulness of sexuality comes from people who struggle with sexuality terribly, and, they had some ridiculous discussions.
Yeah, and this has been going on before Christianity. I mean, the Greeks, the Romans, the Stoics, the Cynics, they were all having problems with all this stuff. It was just...
Yeah, unfortunately. But I think, yes, that we should look, that's why I'm looking into this, maybe less traditions with which we are less familiar. You know, I'm looking for some kind of glimpses of light in some of the Gnostic Gospels, because I think that there were people, and as you mentioned in some other Gnostic documents, you know, who actually try to look at it differently. So I'm trying to fish them out, so to speak. I'm not making any claims that, you know, Gnostics did that, you know, had wild sex, you know, and so on. Absolutely not. I'm just looking for this kind of small insights. Like, for example, in Gospel of Philip, you know, when sexuality is a holy of holies, how beautiful. A union between two people is a holy of holies, how beautiful. You know, and obviously many scholars will jump, oh, it's a metaphor. Well, I don't think so, because we are just used to thinking about it that it has to be a metaphor. Or even if it's even expressed metaphorically, you know, it's still talking about sexuality, it's still talking about the union, you know, of two beings.
Joanna, and what in modern literature or in modern movies or in any literature, what have been some of your favorite portrayals of Mary Magdalene?
In modern movies, I don't think I actually liked any of the portrayals, I must say, but I didn't enjoy it very much. I think that very often she was a very much a kind of one-dimensional character. Do you have any suggestions that you think that, you know, something that really struck you as what you say, multi-dimensional woman that she was, that you've seen?
For me, all of them are my favorite. Like you say, there are slices. I like Anne Bancroft. I like the I don't know her name in The Passion of Christ. The one in Jesus Christ Superstar. She's obviously more well developed and more. She's truer. She's closer. She's more of a leader. So but my favorite would have to be Marla in Fight Club. To me, she's a Mary Magdalene figure, and I've written about it and explained how she really is Mary Magdalene.
Ah, really? I'm sorry. I'm actually not familiar with that. I'll have to check this one, you know?
Oh, okay.
So,
well, if you get it, watch Fight Club, and you probably, it has nothing to do with Christianity, but to me, it's a very powerful, hidden Gnostic message.
I definitely have to check it out then, yes. So, no, I think that for me, you know, the Hollywood and movies are kind of like lagging behind, you know, the whole thing. And so I've never really seen anything that they portrayed in any way as Mary Magdalene as would somehow satisfy me. So I cannot say I do. But I'm just kind of hoping that we can use her, you know, as this symbol for, like, as Jean-Yves Leloup says, of somebody, a woman who is both, you know, beautifully sensual, and as a woman who experienced the divine, you know, in her life, not only because of the presence of Jesus in her life, but she had actually an original experience, you know, of her own divinity in this body, which is this is how I see her, you know, a complete human being, including her sexuality.
Oh, I certainly agree with you. But I think that's all the time we have today, Joanna. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte and giving us a very insightful and stimulating discussion on Mary Magdalene.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.